Hello everybody, it's been quite a quiet couple of weeks early in May as regards developments in commercial real estate. So I thought today I would cover again a topic I covered as a very short podcast, which I did 3 or 4 years ago before I'd started Slade's Property Slice. And it's all about acquiring a new build property, a new build commercial property, and it's got very much an occupier focus to it. So if you are a developer or are on the developer side, this will probably be mostly old hat to you. But if you are an occupier or an end user acquiring or taking a lease of a new building, it might be the first time, indeed the only time you've done this sort of transaction. So I'm just going to say a few useful things which you might want to consider at heads of term stage, which will then obviously feed into the legals. So buying or taking a lease of a new build commercial property is a transaction which is inherently riskier than acquiring an existing building. And the document which we as solicitors use to manage that risk is usually called a development agreement, where you have a new build purchase, and an agreement for lease, sometimes known as a pre-let, on a lease of a new building. On a purchase, you will frequently find that the development agreement is separate from the land purchase agreement. And there's a stamp duty land tax advantage for you as buyer in splitting out the land purchase price in the land purchase agreement from the development price in the separate development agreement. As if it's structured in that way, you as buyer should be able to avoid paying any stamp duty on the development costs which arise under the development agreement, and you'd only pay stamp duty on the land acquisition price. So that's a tax advantage. There's plenty of things that the buyer or tenant of the new build should consider, ideally at heads of term stage. On a purchase, one would naturally expect the purchaser to be paying for the development, not necessarily on a lease where the developer is creating an investment. And it's important where the buyer is paying for the development costs to make sure that the buyer isn't hit by the quite likely risk of cost overruns on the building contract. So you as buyer might wish to consider a maximum financial commitment going into your development agreement so you're not bitten by those overruns on costs. As buyer or tenant, you will want to have as much say in the development process as possible, particularly if this is a one-off bespoke development rather than a unit as part of a development of wider units. So the purchaser or the tenant of the new build should consider whether it wants to have a say in the tender process, in the identity of the contractor. It will want to be able to monitor the development as it goes along and make representations to the developer, possibly through your monitoring surveyor, if things appear not right. And it will also want to have the right to be given notice of and to attend the practical completion inspection and also the inspection prior to the certificate of making good defects. And it's also advisable for you as buyer or tenant to be present at the measurement to verify that the expected size of the unit has been achieved. Now, in development agreements and agreements for lease, you often see tolerance provisions allowing buyers and tenants a reduction in purchase price or rent if there is an underbuild below certain expected sizes, and sometimes a right to walk away if there's a gross underbuild. Now, the buyer or tenant may well be moving out of existing premises or expecting, for example, contracts they have won to crystallise only if they move to the larger premises. And for this reason, it's quite reasonable for the buyer or tenant to ask for an amount in respect of liquidated damages from the developer if a target date for handover isn't met. And it's important to get that request in early in the process, as the developer will then seek to agree back-to-back liquidated damages provisions in its building contract. So the earlier the request, the more clarity at the tender stage. As buyer or tenant, you will also want to insist on collateral warranties from the contractor and all subcontractors with design responsibility, as well as from the main professionals such as the architect, the structural engineer and the employer's agent, who will normally be the party responsible for certifying practical completion. Now, collateral warranties are documents which give the buyer or the tenant recourse against the team if defects appear in the construction, and it's important that the development agreement or the agreement for lease provides for them to be handed over as soon as possible in the process, but the latest on practical completion. Finally, I'd mention that the buyer or the tenant would want the ability to make variations from the developer specification and possibly to select from a menu of extras. As buyer or tenant, you should expect a cost and timing implication if you do so, but it's important, if this is truly a bespoke building for you, to have that flexibility. I hope there are some tidbits for you to think of going forward when buying or taking a lease of a new build. And I'll see you all again in 2 weeks' time.